All right, thanks everybody for joining, and thanks especially to Professor Fang Yu Hu for joining us today. She is an assistant professor of history at Cal Poly Pomona, Cal State colleague, who specializes in modern East Asian history with a focus on Taiwan, gender, colonialism, and cross-border flows. She received her BA in history from UC Berkeley, an MA in social sciences from the University of Chicago, and an MA and Ph.D. in history from UC Santa Cruz. And I was actually just got an email from your xuejie, from Angelina Chin, who is also at Pomona. She's at Pomona College, and she'll be joining us next week, actually. But I didn't know that you were, she said my xuemate, she said she was my classmate. I didn't know that you were both classmates until she sent me that note. Before arriving at Cal Poly Pomona, Professor Hu taught various East Asian and world history courses at Santa Clara University for a year and at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga for 8 years. She enjoys teaching courses on the modern world, ancient to contemporary China and Japan, gender and sexuality in modern East Asia, and World War II, memories in East Asia, with attention to Okinawa, the Ryukyus, and Taiwan. Dr. Hu has published in the journal ERAS of Monash University, 20th Century China, and her first book, which we're going to hear a little bit about today, Good Wife, Wise Mother, Educating Han Taiwanese Girls Under Japanese Rule, was published by University of Washington Press in 2024, and it examines the discourse, implementation, and impact of Japanese colonial education on Han Taiwanese girls in 20th century Taiwan. Her current research focuses on Taiwanese migrants to mainland China and Southeast Asia in the first half of the 20th century. We're very, very fortunate, very grateful to have Professor Hu join us today. Please join me in giving a welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Murray, for your introduction. Can everyone hear me? I want to make sure.
Yes.
I'm not getting feedback. Okay, great. And thanks for inviting me to discuss my book today. I'm very excited. I'll say a few things for a little bit over 10 minutes and then open the floor up for a discussion. First, I'm going to give a quick overview of Taiwan's history before Japanese colonization. I will then summarize my book chapter by chapter and highlight the main arguments about Japanese colonial education in Taiwan with a few quotes here and there. I will end my brief remarks with a quick overview of my sources and methodology. So a quick overview of Taiwan's history. Because I want to highlight the historical experiences of people who live on the island. Various Aborigines. Okay, various groups of indigenous Austronesian live in Taiwan, and the first formal rulers of Taiwan were actually the Dutch in Tainan in southern Taiwan from 1624 to 1662, soon followed by the Spanish in Damzui in northern Taiwan from 1626 to 1642, a result of the European age of exploration from the 15th to the 17th century. It was during this European colonial period that some Han Chinese men from Fujian province, China, immigrated to Taiwan as workers. The Dutch drove out the Spanish in the north, and later the Dutch were driven out by Zheng Chenggong, or Koxinga, as he was known in the West. Koxinga's father was actually a Chinese pirate turned official, and his mother came from a Japanese samurai family. He had pledged loyalty to the collapsing Chinese empire as the Manchus were conquering China, and Zheng Chenggong decided to take over Taiwan from the Dutch as his base to fight against the Manchus when he was losing his grounds in Fujian province in the South China. Zheng Chenggong defeated the Dutch and established a government in southern Taiwan with his followers. You see it's called the Tongning Kingdom. After the Manchus conquered China proper, they conquered Taiwan in 1683. The rule lasted until 1895, as some of you know. The Manchu rulers restricted immigration to Taiwan because it was known as an uncivilized, dangerous place full of indigenous peoples and unruly Han Chinese settlers. But Taiwan became important regionally and globally in the 19th century. Two northern ports were opened as treaty ports to Europeans for tea and camphor. After Japan's expedition to Taiwan in 1874 and the Sino-French War of 1884-85, the Qing government recognized Taiwan's importance and elevated to a province in 1887. When the Qing Empire lost in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, China ceded Taiwan and the Pescadores Islands to Japan. So we see at this point with Japan's colonization, the indigenous and Han populations in Taiwan have been governed by European, Chinese, and Manchu rulers, and now Japanese. And you can see on here, I'm not going to post Japanese period history here, but so you can see the different set of regimes on Taiwan, the island, over the course of the centuries. And then here on the left, this graph somebody has created to show when mainland China and Taiwan were under the same regime, which was basically only under the Qing rule, and also briefly at the end of World War II, but otherwise been sort of different governing entities. The Japanese colonists built various infrastructure like roads, railroads, factories, banks, parks. They organized hygiene and public health campaigns, even set up local newspapers and professional and literary journals. And arguably the most important institution were the schools. So this is where my book comes in to show the importance of the educational system that the Japanese set up. In my book, the introduction contextualizes Taiwan in regional and global history and argues that Taiwan reflects regional and global trends from the late 19th to the mid 20th century. Chapter 1 focuses on why the Japanese set up girls' education from the 1900s to the 1930s. In one interview published in the main government-approved newspaper in Taiwan in 1910, an elementary school principal explained, "Where does a good wife, wise mother come from? If girls' education doesn't flourish, then there will be no good wives, wise mothers. Our school focuses on girls' education. In addition to providing handicraft training, our school also teaches imperial ethics, Japanese language, arithmetic, singing, games, classical Chinese, drawing, and other subjects. Instructors must teach all that is necessary for a good wife, wise mother to know. Heavy makeup is forbidden. Gold rings and other expensive accessories and clothing are not allowed. Simplicity and cleanliness are the best." This interview describes the production of ideal wives and mothers as taking place on school grounds, where girls would not only receive homemaking training, but would also acquire literacy and basic knowledge of a wide range of subjects. The school policy on their students' outward appearance suggests the importance of two feminine virtues, thrift and simplicity, virtues that continue to be promoted during World War II. So in chapter 1, I argued that assimilation is always gendered, as seen through Japanese educational policies and implementation. Chapter 2 focused on how Taiwanese responded to colonial education from the 1920s to the 1940s, and shows that Taiwanese who accepted girls' education inevitably reinforced patriarchy and colonial hierarchy. Chapter 3 discusses wartime mobilization during World War II. So let me share with you what one of my interviewees recalled. Miss Lin was a middle school student in central Taiwan, Taichung, from 1941 to 1944. She recalled, "I was a class president then. The class president had to call on each classmate to help out. It was dark with no electricity, but we had to walk toward the school in the dark and make rice and sushi from this big pot. It was my first time learning how to cook rice in such pot. We students were obedient then. We wrapped the stuff. In the early morning, the rice balls were transported to the soldiers by truck. Goods were scarce, but we didn't eat any of them. Everyone was junjo, which is a Japanese word, means pure. So no one took rice balls home. Her story highlights several features of girls' education under Japanese rule. The virtues of cooking, obeying the nation, teamwork, and obedience with purity that only schoolgirls could exhibit. Working as a team, Lynn and her schoolmates put their cooking training to use. The next chapter, chapter 4, looks at the impact of education from the 1940s to the 1960s and suggests that the impact was greater for those from lower classes than those from the upper classes. And then the final chapter, the concluding chapter, chapter 5, focuses on students' memories in the early 20-teens and a few Japanese teachers' memories in the 1970s. Let me share something that one former local government staff and then a nursing assistant under Japanese rule told me. This is a woman. I have a very good impression of the Japanese people. The Japanese teachers treated students well. They didn't discriminate against us. And so in this chapter, I show how Taiwanese who received Japanese colonial education use their educational and colonial experiences to criticize the post-war Kuomintang government. As one former teacher complained to me, the teaching profession was cheap and bad. That is why Taiwan's education has failed students. It was all the Chinese war veterans who came to teach. Their Mandarin pronunciation wasn't standard. They also didn't know how to teach math. They didn't even have proper schooling or training, yet they became teachers. So overall, my book examines the Japanese government perspective and a Taiwanese perspective. Similar to Euro-American powers at the time, Japanese colonial officials used race and ethnicity as the main markers of political and socioeconomic hierarchy. And I emphasize that gender remained the most powerful and persistent defining marker of colonial hierarchy. Despite institutionalized discrimination, Taiwanese embrace education, including that of girls, because they believe in the changes that educated girls and women symbolize and could bring to Taiwan in the period dominated by great powers, which was something that also happened in China. After colonization ended, Taiwanese bridged their Japanese experiences with the new Chinese nationalist government policies. They used their language proficiencies, work ethics, and professional skills to survive and to support their families under an authoritarian regime. In their old age, after Taiwan democratizes in the 1990s into the 21st century, these Japanese educated Taiwanese sought to reclaim their place in history. So now let me say a few things about sources and methodology to end my remarks. The modern Japanese government was an excellent record keeper, and there are so many sources on education as some of you can imagine. So I looked at educational policies, textbooks, newspapers. You can see a clip, the one on the left here, the Taiwan Daily News, which is the main government-sponsored newspaper in colonial Taiwan. So I look at these different sources to understand the rationale behind assimilation and education and its implementation. But I position this book as a Taiwan-centric book to highlight Taiwanese experiences and voices. To do this, I turn to Taiwanese RAM periodicals and oral history. And so, in addition to several volumes of oral history published in the late 1990s and early 2000s, I conducted interviews with over 50 women and men between the years 2010 and 2013. They were born between 1915 and 1933 and from different parts of Taiwan. They were between the ages of 70 to 90 when I interviewed them. And to interview these people, I had to apply for and receive an IRB, institutional review board exemption. So I'm not sure how many of those who were present have done this before or are planning to do this. I mainly incorporated interviews and other published oral histories in the last 3 chapters of my book. That's the overview, and I look forward to more discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction, and but also, I hope everybody was paying close attention because we got a really excellent overview of Taiwanese history. And these are the slides that I hope everybody was paying attention to, because that's a really important bit of context here, not only for Professor Hu's book, but also for the work that you're doing in terms of understanding how Taiwan fits into that bigger historical sweep that we've been discussing. Okay, much to discuss. Before I pull rank here, I'm going to invite students to ask questions. I saw a few preliminary. Oh, great. Look at all these questions. Let's go sort of around here. William, go ahead and get us started.
So I have a few questions on like population sizes on like the island. My first question is like, do we have an estimate of how many like native like Taiwanese people were on the island before just around when like colonial like powers like starts like settling on the island? Do we have like an estimate of how many people were there?
At the Aboriginal population?
Yeah, the Aboriginal Taiwanese.
I'm going to leave that to Professor Hu. Do we have those numbers, rough numbers?
I'm very bad with the numbers, but if I recall, I think by the end of colonial period, it's a bit different. 3 to 5 million people, I'm not sure, but I know the indigenous population on the onset of Japanese colonization, it's about 5 to 10% only. It has sort of dwindled to make my mind pretty small, which was surprised me. It was mostly the Han settlers at that point.
So to today, are we still at this like low population of like indigenous Taiwanese people? Like, do they never like explode in populations like other regions of China end up doing? Of like
No. They continue to dwindle. I think at this point it's 3%. Last time I sort of saw the stats. But again, the people who work on more like sociologists and anthropologists can look at. But yeah, I think it's more like 3% to 5 or less, I think, because there's a lot of intermarriages and there are these laws. I think they changed the laws as well in the 1990s, to the 2000s, where people can in a way choose if they're of mixed heritage. They can choose to identify or to be in the indigenous group or not. Because I think initially they only I forgot, right? I read this and I totally forgot. They initially allow if it's followed either the mom side or something like that, or dad, and later they allow either one, and then at this and so there's a whole codes that allow people to sort of do that. And I think because of that, a lot of people end up choosing maybe the Han identity, whether or not it's with the I call the older settlers or the more recent group since 1945 who moved to Taiwan since 1945. There are quite a lot of intermarriages.
Thanks, Professor Hu, and thanks, William, for the question. Javier, and then Jade.
So my question is, how did the Taiwanese girls balance their cultural identity with Japanese education? Question.
Thank you for that question. This is I don't know if it's a very complicated question, right? I try to explore this not directly, but in a way indirectly in chapter 4, where I talked about impact. And I mainly look at it through the lens of what I call the home sphere, domestic sphere, looking at how if the sewing and cooking lessons that they learn, they have to take sewing and cooking lessons as part of the homemaking training in school. And so they learned some stuff there, but mostly what I found was that for girls, most of the home a lot of them still receive home training at home, especially from the lower classes, because they were expected to do a lot of chores. But the upper classes, they didn't usually have to do any chores. So they actually learn more in terms of that kind of training through school. And so that's why one person I cited during the war, she learned how to cook. I didn't know how to cook. She never actually planted anything at home, but she had to plant things as part of the wartime mobilization where elementary school and middle schoolers are mobilized to work on a farm. And so there's that. So there's that. And so in terms of, if you ask them, you think you are Japanese, a certain thing like that. I'm remembering right now one interview. I think it's the one I provided a quote for, who was a class person and making rice bowls. I think for her, if I remember correctly, she went to a predominantly Japanese schools. So let me back up. So the Japanese, when they at the beginning of colonization, they set up just simple language programs, mainly targeting boys and men, trying to just train a group of translators who can translate between the Taiwanese and the Japanese. Because the Japanese were surprised to find when they landed in Taiwan that nobody spoke Mandarin, and there were Japanese who can speak Mandarin, but nobody in Taiwan really spoke Mandarin. So they needed someone like actually know Taiwan. And then in the beginning, they have a whole process, and scholars in Taiwan have actually talked about it, where they have to use different translators to sort of mediate and translate between different languages. Anyhow, so that's the beginning. And later on, when they set up a school system pretty quickly for the Taiwanese, and then later, I think within 10 years, the Japanese start coming in. In the beginning, it was mostly Japanese men who moved, but later on, they start bringing their children. So the colonial government actually set up the segregated system where, other presentation I have slides, but I didn't prepare for this. So the basically segregated system, you have Japanese children only schools, and then middle school, that's where they can have co-education, although the policies were set up so that pretty much was mostly Japanese who attended middle school and high school, middle school, high school, and then college in Taiwan. They set the Imperial Taipei University, or Taihoku Imperial University, which is currently the National Taiwan University. And then Taiwanese were more in the vocational training, like School of Agriculture and Commerce, Industry, those kind of schools. So it was sort of segregated again at elementary school level. But later in 122, they had this ordinance, education ordinance, where they formally allow for the co-education of Taiwanese and Japanese, for desegregation, you can call it that way. But in reality, the rule is that for the formerly what used to be Japanese only schools, to enter those schools, you have to prove you can speak Japanese as a first grader. Okay. So that pretty much only means a very few Taiwanese whose maybe parents were already in the system, who were proficient, and spoke Japanese to their children since birth. They were able to then enter those schools. Right. So anyway, so there's that system of segregation, and then so coming back to the interview, I'm coming back to interview. I talked about this woman. I think she went to a predominantly Japanese only school, and then she ended up going to middle school where it was half Japanese, half Taiwanese. And when I tried to ask her about discrimination, how they're documented cases of, in terms of admission policy, which is heavily favoring the Japanese, things like that, they didn't feel like it was discrimination. The way a lot of these interviews talked about the educational experiences was it was equal. They were judged based on their merit. That's something they talk about. So for that, I'm not sure. I'm gonna get to your question. I know you asked about cultural identity. So in terms of school, I think I have a sense that women might have less of a sense of that national, maybe cultural identity in terms of like more nationalistic, like, oh, those are Japanese and we're Taiwanese compared to boys. Boys had a lot of tension starting middle school and onward, and then they've been documented. And so a lot of anti-Japanese activists had those backgrounds. For the women, they tend to have the sense of harmony. People got along with their Japanese teachers, their Japanese classmates, and they had the reunions even after 1945, where they met with each other and they visit Taiwan or they go visit Japan, and there's a lot of interactions. But I do think ultimately they could tell that they are different. though going back to that one person I'm thinking about, Miss Lin. I think I'm not sure she would say she's Japanese, but she told me she had to learn the Taiwanese language, her home language, Taiyu, or Taiwanese mainland dialect, after 1945 at home. She didn't actually speak it. She was mostly speaking Japanese before that. But I don't know, just because you spoke Japanese all along, she never told me she thought she was Japanese. So that's the part where, I mean, when you ask about cultural identity, I think of both national and ethnic and cultural, right? It's a lot of that. But if you look at chapter 4, I think in conclusion, if I would say something about where they assimilate or culturally, right, assimilating to being Japanese, there's definitely elements of that, and some might be more assimilated than others. Because some, for example, it has been documented by a scholar from Japan, for example, who has found that women who went through middle school education, which is really rare. These are basically rich people, upper middle class people were able to send their daughters to middle school. They're the ones who retain a lot of Japanese. So after 1945, they continue to read Japanese magazines and journals to learn about homemaking, sewing, and things like that. They even took sewing classes from a Japanese teacher who remained in Taiwan, a Japanese women who remained in Taiwan. For some of them, the husband died in the war and they maybe remarry or just somehow stay in Taiwan. So there continues to be those kind of interactions. And to what degree that affected their, maybe shape or reinforce their identity, I'm not sure. I didn't work on that aspect of the project, though I'm thinking about maybe I'll do something, in a future project, but I'm not sure. So sorry, that's a long answer to a question I think you asked. Because I see a lot of things are sort of connected, and this is a really complex question that you asked.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Good questions, William and Javier. But we're going to move around, William, and we'll come back because we got a few more questions. Jaden, and then Sam, and then we'll come over to Chuck.
Is there still remnants of that Japanese education system in modern day Taiwan?
So I haven't looked at the education system right now. The system has gone through some changes. So some of you might know, when the Kuomintang, the Chinese nationalist government, moved to Taiwan, relocate, or you can call it exile in Taiwan. They began this program called re-Sinification, right? Try to make the Taiwanese Chinese again, or make them Chinese, because the nationalists saw all the Taiwanese having been Japanized, have become Japanese. They cannot be trusted. They don't know what Chinese is. So there's a huge campaign in terms of school system and everything. And then there were a couple of people wrote books about it on that whole process. And so it was more rigid, you can say, and then people learn about sort of the history of China as a whole. I was born in Taiwan. I moved to US at the end of my elementary school, and I still remember the map of China I learned as a young child, right, in elementary school. Looks like a maple. They call it as a maple leaf because it includes Mongolia, the ingredient country, and China today, and Taiwan. So there's that. But then there start to be changes in the 1990s with Taiwan's democratization. And then I think started in mid-1990s, because with the election, the first direct presidential election in Taiwan in 1996, where Li Denghui, who succeeded Jiang Jingguo, who was Chiang Kai-shek's son. So Li Denghui was the vice president of Jiang Jingguo, and then he succeeded him for one term, and then he allowed for basically people actually electing Taiwan's parliament, because Taiwan's parliament up to 1990-91 actually were Chinese representatives who were elected in China in 1947, basically right before they moved to Taiwan. I got the dates mixed up, but they basically were elected and based on like the population of the different Chinese provinces. Anyway, so he in 1996 allowed for first presidential election, direct election. People actually vote, because before it was the Taiwan's legislative yuan that actually voted for the president. But he opened up, and then I think during that whole political reform, democratization process, they start to reform Taiwan's educational textbooks, where they start to put in emphasis on Taiwan, like knowing Taiwan, where people can learn more about Taiwan's history. And then I know things have changed again after 2000 with the first political transition from the Kuomintang to the Democratic Progressive Party, Minqing in Taiwan, which is deemed as a pro-Taiwan or like the for advocating for Taiwan independence. That group, they won, and then I think there were more changes since the 21st century. But then when Ma Ying-jeou of the Kuomintang Party won the election, presidential election in 2008, there was like a wave of changing. And I remember following the news at a time where he was trying to remove a lot of the history that were based that were on that said indigenous people of Taiwan, which have been highlighted since 2000, like 21st century. I think because the new sense of Taiwan's history is that, oh, we want to look at history based on people who live on this land. So it's more, I don't know how geography, but it's Taiwan based. And it's moving away from a Sino-centric, Han centric perspective of history and looking at Taiwan, right? Looking at the land, how the different waves of migration, right? Different regimes, European, Japanese, Chinese, Manchu, I want to call Manchu Chinese, is also a debate, right? So there's been that. And so anyway, so there's been basically an idea of more diversity, even highlighting Hakka. So in Taiwan, the dominant group is the Holo people, the people based ancestry to Fujian province, speaking the Taiwanese language, but then the Holo, the Minnan language, but there's also Hakka group within the Han population. And their culture also has been highlighted since 21st century under Chen Shui-bian, the DPP. So I'm giving you a lot of information. Hopefully some of you will catch up on some of this, or Professor Marie will tell you more about it. So all of that happens, but then I think Ma Ying-jeou in 2000, after during his tenure from 2008 to 2016, they were changing the textbook where my understanding is that he's trying to recenter the Han migration, looking at Taiwan's history through the Han settlers' perspective again. So sort of decenter maybe the role that indigenous people play, or like the history that that they have while they live in this land and continue to live in Taiwan. And yeah, so this is sort of a long question to your
No, these
answer the
are
question.
I think you're filling in so much of what the students need to know. It is really a great primer, not just on the focus topic of your book, but also you're filling out so much of what I think is essential to the broader history of Taiwan, its relationship with the mainland, and much more. I know we've got questions just a second from Sam and Chuck, but I also want to welcome in Qin Laoshi. Angelina Qin is joining us from Pomona College, another neighbor, kind of in between us and Professor Hu, actually, right now. And Professor Qin will be joining us next Wednesday to talk about her research. But I see your hand there, Angelina. You should be able to unmute and jump in.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So, hello, Fang Yu. Just saw you on Monday. I joined late, so I apologize, for not hearing the first part, and maybe you have covered that already. And I've only read, a small part of your book, so I apologize if what I'm gonna say is like, not, it's already been covered. I'm teaching a class on gender and feminism in East Asia, like the history of gender and feminism in East Asia. So it covers 20th century, like China, Japan, and Korea mainly. But I do want to bring in Taiwan and Hong Kong and places like Okinawa that are, less well covered in traditional history courses. So I'm trying to pick your brain and see what you think like I should do in incorporating your book into a class like that. Like if we talk about gender and feminism in East Asia, I know that your book is trying to situate, the question of gender in terms of a colonial framework, and try to talk about identity and citizenship under Japanese rule. I'm just wondering, like, is that like the framework you would like you would teach it if you're going to teach your own book? Like, is it to kind of maybe try to see the status of women under Japanese colonialism and maybe perhaps compare it with Korea and other maybe like Japanese Manchuria or other places, or would you situate that like the subject of Taiwanese female education like in the framework of Chinese history and look at it as like this is a kind of Chinese history that we don't really see or like could you maybe enlighten me and tell me how I should talk about your book and what would be the best framework in trying to understand the narrative that you are presenting in your work.
Thank you so much for that question, Angelia. The part about incorporating my book into your teaching, this is difficult. But the short answer for the first, in terms of your class, the class you're teaching next semester, gender and feminism, I would say my book cannot really do much, I think. I talk about in chapter 2 of my book where it's strange and I have a sense of why based on what other scholars have said, but I wasn't looking at feminism and women's movement. Well, of course, I came across those. And then some other scholars based in Taiwan and then one in the US. Doris Chang has a book on women's movement in Taiwan in the 20th century. So she traced that and she has one chapter on the Japanese colonial period. So
But this is about gender. So
okay. So it's not feminism. If it's not feminism, then I'm thinking in terms of movement and stuff like that. I don't have much because Taiwan's movement was very small because I did a little comparison in chapter 2. It doesn't compare at all to what happened to place of in China, Japan, and Korea. It's almost like non-existent. There's a debate among some scholars who said I didn't start until post-war period. And then some argue, oh no, you can see like the birth where there were seeds being planted, and then there were people working on that during the colonial period in the 1920s before the wartime period started to censor everything. In terms of how to look at education, I think the beginning when I was writing the book, I came with this idea more. I was coming with the narrative I was getting from works in the China field, right? It's like if you look at China-Japan relation, there's a sense of it's very binary. The nationalistic narrative would look at historical actors either as collaborators or patriots. And when I look at colonial Taiwan as a whole, just in general, it's a bit complicated. As we know, we see other colonial spaces where a lot of people are not actively thinking about, yes, I love this colonial regime, or oh, I hate this regime, and therefore I'm going to do X, Y, and Z because I support it or I'm against it. Most people are sort of just, I guess, try to get by. That's my sense. So my hope has been through this, looking at the school side where, I mean, by the end of the colonial period, Taiwan has the highest school enrollment rate in East Asia after Japan. The rate is 70%, 60% girls, and then 70%, 80% boys. And so the average was like 60%. By 1944, I think that's the last time we did this survey of 43. And so I think it will break that binary of when we look at just, I think, the history of modern China, and especially it's at the different colonial side, right, in the treaty ports and places like that. We shouldn't just look at these historical actors through a lens of did you collaborate it or did you resist it? These imperial powers, colonial powers. That's like in the very beginning of the way I thought about what my project can do. And I haven't thought specifically about, let's say, if because I struggle with this. I remember I tried to figure out, do I place this history I'm trying to write about within gender studies, women's studies in the China field, or within the Japan field, within like the empire study in the Japan field. But I found that I can't just pick one, it's in both. And so that's why I try to say, I think if you read a little bit of my book, that's what I tried to talk about in chapter 1. And I'm trying to now think about like some of the missionary education books I've read, from the Republican period, even a little before that. that's where. So I think if I come back, because I haven't thought, like I said, I haven't thought about the specific part about girls' education, but I think there's something about maybe a Japanese official colonial education targeting girls versus, let's say, missionary schools in China, which right they were originally organized, ran, and later with a lot of Chinese input, of course. And then along with maybe how the Chinese officials, either local officials or the central government, start to pay attention to girls' education, and see what, like, the way I think about is, were the goals the same? Because to me, the little comparison I did in the introduction is that they all believed in this idea that educated girls will save our country, will save our nation from imperial domination. That's something that the Koreans, the Japanese definitely believe that, of course. The Koreans, the Chinese, and I'm getting a sense probably the rest of the world really, especially colonies, really believe in. They bought into this modern education as the tool to fight against imperialism, especially Western imperialism. When this in the East Asian case against Japanese colonialism. So that's what I can think of right now. But I can think further along this question, and then we can have further exchange via email or something.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question, and Angelina, and thank you, Fang Yu, for another really great answer that sparks off many, many more questions. I love the idea of complicating, looking at places, and as Angelina looks at Hong Kong, but I look at Hainan, and we're all kind of in some ways at the margins of Chinese history, and so or what may even challenge the definition of Chinese history in some ways. So that thinking about problematizing what the students here, when we look at the war next week, are going to have to deal with in terms of the collaborator versus patriot dichotomy, and sort of rejecting that. And I think that is sort of ripe for rejection. So I think this is a really great tonic for that kind of conversation. We had hands in the room from Sam and then Chuck. And then we'll come back to William if we have time here. Sam, please jump in.
Yeah, I was just curious, from what I've gathered, I feel like you're kind of articulating that Taiwanese girls either accepted Japanese education, tried to get through it, either of those two. Were there any examples of them not accepting it or even refuting it, or anything like that?
So the thing is, right, if you think about the object of study, in my case, school, and I only interview people who got educated. So it's in a way the bias, right? People, when their parents sent them over or something. I think the idea of education has really became global around this time, where people who are paying attention believe in it. The people who were rejecting initially, including Japan, there was a big resistance against school. They thought the government's going to take away the children and do stuff with them, maybe, I don't know, eat them or whatever. I mean, there's a story about in the missionary, like the churches like in China, right? That somebody may heard about, like in the Tianjin massacre, for example. So there was really real fear, like what's the government going to do with my children? Because children have been part of the family economy, especially the peasant family, which most people are farmers in East Asia, right? And so there's a really real fear. And in Taiwan, really, even by the end of the colonial period, majority, because I remember someone questioned me, because most Taiwanese women and girls did not get educated. It's not even 50% as a whole population-wise, even by the end of 1945. If you talk about the reach of education, it wasn't as broad as like what happened in Japan, for example. And so do you want to call that resistance? I'm not sure, because a lot of families, they didn't send their girls to school because they kept them home for economic reason. You need to watch your little siblings, your younger siblings, babysit them or do some chore, clean the house and cook for us while we're, doing your labor. So there's economic necessity for them to stay at home. So some girls did not go to school. Taiwan, we earlier talked about the different stuff about Taiwan. Taiwan is a different culture. It is sort of like treated as a frontier in the Qing Empire, right? So there's some other stuff I won't go into, for the sake of time, but just so you know, there's different stuff going on, and some of you probably know different regions of China. Like some scholars have documented South China. Certain practices are very different from China, northern China or in the Jiangnan area, the whole the Pearl Delta region area. So there's stuff going on. The if I'm thinking about, let's say, people who receive education and just reject it, I don't think so. I think even thinking about the Korean case as well, or let's say the Japanese case, the one who became active in women's movement or other movement, like some even, let's say, I'm thinking about right now, like, I haven't taught in a while. What's her name? Blanking out right now. Sorry, the famous Chinese anarchist, women anarchists. It's not Zheng. It's forgot her name right now. Sorry. So like she's educated, but she can turn like anarchists, right, by door of government. But that in her case is a bit more extreme. But for most others, like they didn't just denounce education. That's what I'm trying to say. They might end up using it as a tool to fight against something, authority or a certain group, of fight for like women's rights. But nobody, as far as I can tell, actually say no, education is bad. That's actually the old idea, right? People who say, oh, so that's, for me, that's an interesting thing, how education had become just widely accepted as the thing to pursue. Even when you don't want your kids to go for a certain reason, that there are more opportunities for those with education. Hopefully that sort of answers the question.
100%. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Fang. Chuck, jump in, please. And if others, we have time for other questions. We'll come back to William, and then if others have questions, please raise your hands.
I can say past 3:30, but so if you guys are interested, like a little, yeah.
I have a question about the infrastructure that was handed to Chiang Kai-shek. Was basically in place for him. It was kind of handed to him on a silver platter. My second question is also the families of the soldiers who had to fight for Japan during World War II. Was there retribution by Chiang Kai-shek towards them?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, so just quickly, so everyone might know, yeah, so a lot of Taiwanese, again, I don't really focus on post 1945 period, but the sense is that Chiang Kai-shek's government, his officials basically went to Taiwan, just replaced the Japanese left, they just replaced the Japanese. So for some Taiwanese interviews, I think including some published in oral history, they basically say we have basically another round of colonization. This is another foreign regime coming in, and we're enjoying equality here. In terms of family, so as some of you know, by 1945, Taiwanese men started being drafted into the military. But as early as 1937, 38, volunteers were asked to serve as porters and other like wartime suppliers. The Japanese didn't trust the Taiwanese to become soldiers because Japan was fighting war against China, and they fear the common ancestry, right? Because most Taiwanese trace ancestry to China. They doubt, the Japanese doubted the loyalty of these Taiwanese. But by 1942, 43, they start asking for volunteer, like people join the Navy and so forth, because Japan expanded quickly in Southeast Asia, as many of you know. So they fought for them. And then as many of these imperial soldiers, so some were trapped, couldn't come back for a while, but the ones who were back, or maybe they never got deployed or trained, some of them they were ordered to fight in the Chinese Civil War. So I don't think, from what I heard, I don't think there's retribution against the soldiers. I mean, some were actually put on war, the Tokyo tribunal, tried as war criminals, and a couple of them were executed. I think mainly the guards, people who Taiwanese were prison guards and POWs in Southeast Asia, and reporting them really mistreated, abused the POWs, European American POWs, so they were executed. Yeah, so there were those. So again, my understanding, the little bit I know, is that there's no retribution, just they were then deployed again to fight in the Civil War. Yeah, and then some didn't come back. I know there's a couple stories of some did not make it back to Taiwan until later, because Taiwan is in this weird limbo, right? They were Japanese subjects, but now Japan lost the war, and all of a sudden Japan is sort of like, oh, I guess you're not ours, and Koreans, you're not ours, so we're not gonna prioritize the repatriation of you guys back to your homeland. We're gonna take care of our Japanese guys. But then the Chinese government didn't necessarily trust these Taiwanese, initially, like this been documented different parts of China, of these Taiwanese who've been collaborating with the Japanese, and some of them, I think some of them, the treaty ports and so forth in mainland China were tried as workmen or hanjian. But in terms of the soldiers directly, you asked about soldiers. I don't think I've heard stuff. Again, they were deployed to fight.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chuck, and thanks, Fang Yu, for the answer. Willie, come back here. And if others have questions, we do have a few more minutes. Go ahead.
So I have two additional questions. One on like the I guess cultural identity of like the native Taiwanese people, where it's, were they more of a like singular like cultural identity with like similar like thought process, or were it like several smaller groups that kind of got umbrellaed when like we saw the colonialism like occupy the island? And did that kind of impact which like groups decided to try and educate like their like children when like the Japanese took over and was trying to like educate people on the island?
Thank you for that question. So I'm going to assume you're talking about the indigenous groups, the Aborigines. I don't, because I don't specialize in that, and that's a separate field from when you're looking at Taiwan studies. There are many different groups in Taiwan, and so let's talk about the hierarchy. Let's talk about the Japanese period. So during the Japanese period, they classify the Aborigines groups into the sort of two major groups. The mountainous Aborigines, indigenous, and then the one in the plains. Mainly they engage in agriculture and they interacted a lot with the Han population. And the ones in the hills, deep in the mountains, they are not. And so during the Qing period, those in the mountains were called raw, some find like raw barbarians or savages, and the one that are farm, they call like cooked barbarian, like 熟饭, 那地饭, that饭. And so the Japanese inherited that classification from the Qing, although later they changed the name to sound better, like Gaoshanzu, like Gaoshan, like high mountains for the mountain, this one, and then the plain one, they like Pingdizu, I think that's term, I'm forgetting it now. So there is that classification. I don't have a sense that they, let's say, gather together as one group because of colonial powers, or even, let's say, afterwards with the nationalist government. But I think right now, after the 21st century, with an awareness of their cultures, and then there's an official government recognition of the different tribes, you can get recognition and so forth. There currently, I think, 13 recognized groups in Taiwan, indigenous groups, and they speak different languages. They're all Austronesian group, but they speak different languages, have different cultures, different customs. So I'm getting a sense it is in the 21st century that they start like identity of like, oh, we're all indigenous people, 原住民. So there's now a sense of that. I think that's a very recent thing. And that did not come from because there's a different colonial power come in and do that. But the group that has that power, though, is actually with Japanese colonization. But let me back up. So there were divisions within the Han settlers, within the mainland speaking groups. There are actually two major groups because the ancestors trace to Zhangzhou and Quanzhou part of Fujian, which speak a language that's closer to like Xiamen area. My understanding is those languages are very different from Fujian. If you go to Fuzhou, the capital of Fujian, they speak a very different mainland language compared to the one in Xiamen or the one in basically what people in Taiwan, like the Han, Holo people in Taiwan speak. So those two areas have very in the languages actually. And so apparently when they settled in Taiwan, there's division. They constantly fought against each other using arms and stuff, and they would occupy territory. And then also they're like, they also act like they're different from the Hakka people. But I think it was with Japanese colonization that at least those two groups within the mainland spoken group, they team up together, have a sense of, oh, we're Taiwanese somehow. And then the Hakka, I think also among some, that's a sense I'm getting. They also, I think, because my understanding is the emergence, I have a sense the emergence of this, maybe the early days of some kind of Taiwanese identity might have been born during this time, and that's with Japanese colonization, I think. But the Japanese, they did classify, so they classified the mainland, I mentioned the two groups, right, but they came up together. The Japanese classified them when a household registration, they put down Fujian. And then for the Hakka group, they put down Guangdong, assuming everyone, like their ancestors all came from Guangdong province. So there's that classification in the household registration. And so because I don't study that, I'm not sure if that's the reason why, like because of social designation that force people to work together, or is it really because of the other treatment? These different groups used to fight against each other, but now they see another power come in and treating them, maybe group them together, treat them the same way. They're in the same boat, so therefore they start working together. But there's been documentation of the Hakka and non-Hakka Han people working together, and then they use Japanese language as a common language, which may be not surprising to you. And then I remember I interviewed one woman who's Hakka, but she later on remarried a Holo person, and they use, I think, Japanese, but eventually I think she probably also learned Holo because she's married to a men's family. She had to learn the men's family's language. So I'm going all around about to try to answer your question, but that's the instance I can see where certain groups that maybe become together and have a sense of certain identity, new identity, because of a colonial power.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question, William. And Professor Hu, Fang Yu, we are at time, I think. And we don't have any outstanding questions right now. So I think it is a good time to move toward wrapping up. Thank you so much. I got so much from this book, and I got so much from the talk. It really established an excellent foundation for our students to encounter Taiwanese history, and gives us a lot of very, very rich context. Especially this last question from William gave us a real sense of the complexity of Taiwan society and Taiwanese culture. There's a lot to learn there. There's a lot to understand. And I love that you also gave us a little bit of insight into your research process, which is very, very cool for these upper division history students who are getting ready to embark on their own senior research paper. Some of you guys are already working on those, but I always love the chance to hear from scholars about their ongoing research. I just went through the IRB process here, which is absolutely delightful, of course. Everybody loves going through a good piece of bureaucracy, nothing like it. But on the other side, of course, you have a lot of exciting research possibilities. But it is good to do, and I do encourage students to think about doing that. If you want to go do interviews for your senior paper, that kind of thing, it is good to know what's involved there in terms of the ethics. All right, that was really, really great. Thank you so much, Ulausher, Professor Hu. It's so cool to virtually meet you, to learn a little bit about your work. I hope that you're feeling better and resting well over the coming days. Thank you so much for pushing forward and joining us anyway on Zoom. It's really been our great benefit.
Again, thank you so much, everyone, for your wonderful questions, including questions I haven't thought of, and then the implications of this book, and also hopefully my future research as well. So stay cool, everyone, this weather, and good luck the rest of the semester.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
All right, great. Let me see here. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.